Alright, so this should be a relatively short video where we're going to basically take a look at doing file I/O, file input output. At this point, really all I care about is just giving you guys an example of how to read in file. We're not going to talk about writing out the file. We may cover that next week when we have class. But for this really simple video and for the assignment that I'm going to give you guys this week, I just want you to be able to read in text and do something trivial with it. So I've set up an example right now. So I have the Charge of the Light Brigade poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson here in a text file. It's just sitting right here on my desktop. And I've already got a program written that's basically going to read this in and do something very trivial with the text that it reads in. But before we can do that, or actually, you know, let's slow down. Here's the program, very simply, some kind of high-level things that we know we need to do. We need to import Java I/O library again. So we've seen this before, but whenever we're using the Bufferedreader, or in this case the file reader class, we need to import the java.io library. And you can import these specifically, but I'm a slacker, and so we'll just import the entire library. For this, it doesn't really matter. I'm also not using the try-catch block and to trap any errors associated with this code. So I also have to have this throws IO exception up here at the end of the main method. Now there's a couple things in this particular program that we haven't really dealt with before, particularly starting with this. So we've typed this since the first program we've written, and we just finished learning about arrays. So you should understand that this line right here is going to actually declare an array, a string array called args, A-R-G-S. And you also should be able to surmise that it's actually an argument that's being passed to the main method. Now, we don't ever call the main method directly, but the main method is where our program begins its execution, right? So really what this does is give you the opportunity to pass an argument to your program on the whole. So whereas we use methods inside of our program to send things, data types, data information, whatever, to other methods within our application, within our code, you can do the same thing from outside of your program at the command line when you call your main or when you call your program and you execute your program. You can think of this as probably something, an example most people would be, used to seeing would be like a ping command, right? If you open a command prompt or a shell and you type ping and then you provided an IP address, well, ping is the program. The IP address is the argument that you're passing the program. So the idea is the same here. We would call file IO fun, and maybe we can pass it some arguments if we need to, or if the program is expecting us to. Now, I haven't done a bunch of error catching and handling and all that sort of thing in this program because I really want you to see what's going on up front. So if I were to run this program right now, all this program does is basically it's expecting you to give it two arguments. The first argument would be the path to the file. So eventually we're going to use this file right here, the path to this file. The other thing that it's going to look for is a word. And basically what this program does is it's going to loop through this poem, and it's going to look at each line one at a time. And if it finds the word that you said you want to look for, it's just going to print that line of the poem. So very simple program. So as I just said, it's expecting you to tell it A, what the path to this file is, and B, what word you're looking for that you want it to print the lines for. If we ran this right now without looking at the particulars, if we ran this right now, knowing that we're looking for two arguments to be passed to our program, and the fact that we're not giving the program anything yet because we haven't set that up, something we're going to talk about in just a moment, you'll notice that we're going to get an array index out of bounds exception. If you go look at where this happens in our code, it happens at line 23, and it's right here where we're using this args at index 1. So we know that this is an array, and we know that we're trying to look at index 1. Well, if we haven't given our program any arguments to work with, then it makes sense that there wouldn't be a value here. So what we need to understand is basically inside of NetBeans and outside of NetBeans, how might we give the program the arguments that it needs. Just as a for instance, let me show you from this side. If I were to run this at the command prompt from the shell, I've already compiled. I just want to run this program. I'm not going to give it any arguments, and I get the same exact error, right? So what we need to be able to understand is how can we give arguments at the command line or at the shell, and then how can we give arguments inside of NetBeans? Well, inside NetBeans, it's really simple, actually. If you go up to the top and you go to your Run menu, you want to set project configuration, and then you want to come over here to customize. Now, when you get here, you see there's a nice area right here called arguments. Now, with most applications, this is probably true. Certainly with Java, arguments are delimited by spaces. So if you did something like this, you would be passing 4 individual arguments. This would be args0, this would be the value at args1, args2, and args at index 3. If you had an argument that you needed to pass it that had spaces in it, suppose you had a file path like my documents. This is if we were on Windows, right? What you would need to do is you would need to put the argument in quotations, and then what will happen is the application will see this as one argument. So the phrase my space document would be the value of arg0. A would be in args1, B would be in args2, C in args3, and so on. If we had another one, right, we could put it in quotes, and this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So in our case, what we want to do is we want to actually put the path to where our file is. I think this path is right. I'm going to call it charge. Oops. So now we've basically provided one argument. I'm going to save this right here without providing the second, and just click OK. If we run this now, we're still going to get, oops, I think I must have typed into something. Yeah, didn't mean to do that. This would be args1. If I run this now, and it compiles, you'll see now we still get another IO exception, right? Because while we did give it one argument, we didn't give it a second argument. So the second argument would actually be at index 1. Args0 would be at index, or at the first, that would have been the first argument that we provided. Notice here that args is an array, so we can still talk about the length of the array. And so right here, the very first thing the program does is it talks about how many arguments were provided. So because we just added the file path, you can see that we provided one argument to this program, but we need to have 2, right? So if we go look at the poem itself, maybe we look for canon, right? So if I come back into my Run menu, I go to Set Project Configuration, I go to Customize, I get to the end of my first argument. Notice there's no spaces here, so I didn't have to put it in quotes. If there had been spaces in this file path, I would have had to add quotes to make this work correctly. And then we said we were going to look for the word canon in our program. So we have a path, which is argument 1, or really at index 0, and the second argument is the word canon, which we're passing as the second argument. So I'm going to click OK. Now if we run this, we should see that we can't find the file, which means I typed something wrong. So users, oh, let's try this. Slash there, see if that solves our problem. There we go. Helps if you get the file path correct. All right, so basically what this program has done is it says we've provided 2 arguments. We've read in this file that's over here in this text file. We've read in this text file, and basically the way that we're reading it in is we're reading it in line by line. And for each line, all we're doing is checking to see if that second argument, the word canon, shows up in the line. And if it does, then what we want to do is we want to print that line. And so as you can see, this program will print every line that has the word canon in it, and these are the 6 lines that have the word canon in it. Now I ignored everything else. Right? If I wanted to simply just pre-print the entire program, or I'm sorry, the entire text file, I'll just comment this out. And if I ran this now, you'll see this will print the entire, right? It's simply just reading in a line from the text file, and then it's printing it out. And then it's reading the next line, and it's printing it out. And we'll walk through exactly how we do that in just a moment. But I want to show you the same thing over on this side. So if we're executing from command line, we should be able to do something like this, right? So Java is it's already we've already compiled our code, and so or actually let me recompile it since we just made that change to print the entire. So Java C, and we can't do it that way. We have to do it this way. File out fun. Java. So this is Java C is saying we want to compile this inside this folder, which is the directory I'm in, or the directory that I want to go into, and the name of the file. We can execute that. That just compiles it, creates a class file for us. Just as a reminder, if we look at what's in there now, we'll have our Java file, which is this thing right here that we're editing. And then there's also this thing in here called a class file, which is basically the machine code version, the compiled version of the Java file we just were editing. Now, if we want to run this file, we can come back up here and we can actually run this. So if we run this without giving it any arguments, again, we'll see that we get an array index out of bound exception, which means we didn't give it all of the arguments that we needed to give it. But then we can also come in and do basically what we did through NetBeans. It's called charge. And we want to look for, we'll look for the word light. How about that? Oh, I didn't recompile it. So it's going to print the entire thing. It's basically ignoring that second argument. It's not simply looking for everything with light in it. But regardless, we still had to give it that argument, that parameter. So we provided 2 arguments, and then because we made that change where we commented out this if statement, it printed the entire text file. So let me recompile one more time, and then let's run it one more time with the word light, and this time we'll see that it's only going to print the lines of the poem that have the word light in them. All right. So something to get used to is the idea that you can pass arguments to your program. So when you see string.arg or you see the string array args, it doesn't have to be called args. It just almost always is. When you pick up other people's code, you'll almost universally see this word args, but it could be called whatever you want it to be called. Args obviously stands for arguments. You can specify your arguments in your project configuration by going this route. Or if you're running from a shell or from a command prompt, you can do it simply by putting spaces between the parameters, the arguments that you're passing it. Now, a really interesting thing to do for this particular program, I'm not going to do it, but maybe it's something you guys could think about doing as an exercise, is to basically check to see if the user gives the appropriate number of arguments before you try to execute the program, right? So if the user doesn't give you 2 arguments, this is messy and not very useful. So it'd be really easy to simply look at the length, for instance, of args to try to ascertain the number of arguments that were passed. And then only if you have the correct number of arguments would you try to do whatever it is that your program's trying to do. So if they don't give you in this particular program, if they don't give you 2 arguments, then maybe you give them an error message that says you need to run this program with 2 arguments, or give them some sort of instruction that's more useful to them than an error message that looks like this, which means nothing to the user, obviously. But for this particular example, I left that out because I really wanted you to see kind of how this all works together. But the last thing we need to do is obviously, and kind of the main reason of creating this program, is to show you all a really simple example of how to tap into a text file or any file and pull information or data out of it. So let's just trace through this one really quickly. You get a system.out.println that's just simply saying this is the number of arguments you've given me. Again, args.length is going to be indicative of the number of arguments passed to the program. And then it will tell you that whatever you give us in the second argument, whether it was canon or in this last example, light, right? It's going to say we're going to look for that word, and we're going to print any row, or I'm sorry, any file, any line in the file that has that particular word in it. So the first thing I do is I create a variable called path. It's a string variable, and I store in it whatever the user provided at arg0. So the first argument they provided is going to be the path to the file that I want to read in. In this case, right, it was users cmary desktop charge.txt, right? The second argument, args1 of our array, is going to be stored in a variable called word defined. Now that word is simply the word that we're looking for in our text. So, and then the final thing we do is we declare a variable called line, and we're going to use this to store each line of the text as we read it in. So the first time a line gets assigned a value, it'll be this, the charge of the Light Brigade. The next time it will be by Lord Alfred Tennyson. The next time it will be a carriage return. Next time would be half a league, and so on, until you get to the end of the file. Now, when you get to the end of the file, and you get to here, and you try to read in the next line, what will happen is the string variable line will get assigned a value of null. And so that's how we know we've reached the end of the line, when we hit a null value. So we create a buffered reader object. This is a little bit different than what we've seen before when we get input from a user. Instead of an input stream reader that we pass it a file reader, and then the file reader takes an argument, and that argument is the path, right? So the path to the file that we want to read in. And then we hit a while loop. Now, a while loop's good here because we don't necessarily know how many times we want to loop. We just know that we want to start at the beginning of the file and we want to go to the end of the file. So if the file is 5 lines, this while loop would execute 5 times. If the file has 1,000 lines in it, this loop would execute 1,000 times. The way this is structured is a little bit different than what we've seen before, because we actually have an assignment statement inside of a while loop, which is a little bit funky. But it works. It's perfectly legitimate. There are other ways that you could do it outside of this, but a lot of the examples that you'll see if you were searching on how to do this would look something like this. Now what's happening here is basically the inner parentheses are getting executed first. So n.readline is how we get the next line of text from our text file. And then we're basically taking that line of text and we're assigning it to the variable that we created up here called line. And then we are checking to see if line is not equal to null. So when line equals null, we know that we've reached the end of our file. As long as line does not equal null, we know that we want to keep doing this loop and keep reading in files and that sort of thing. So this piece right here, just to make sure you're not confused, is going to take whatever the next line that's read in from the file, and it's going to assign it to the variable line. So if we looked at what was saved in the variable line at this point, it would be whatever the line of text that was read in. Once this assignment takes place, then we check to see if line is equal or is not equal to the value null. Okay. The next thing we do inside of our while loop is we check to see if the uppercase version of line is whether or not it has the word that we're trying to find that's also bounced to uppercase. Now we bounce these to uppercase just to normalize the input to make sure that capital light versus lowercase light or any mixture of uppercase and lowercase is ignored. We don't care if light is capital or lowercase, doesn't matter. Either way that it shows up, we want to find it, so we're bouncing it to uppercase. We're using this string operator called contains, which is basically going to return true or false, whether or not that the string, the line string, which is holding the line of text we just read in from the file, whether or not it has the word we're trying to find. So if the word that we're trying to find is in the word or is in the string line, then it will return true, in which case we would then print the line, which is why we get output that looks like this. So if we wanted to change this, let's maybe find another interesting, let's say horse. If we wanted to see how many times the word horse was, or how many lines had the word horse in it, we could come back in here, we could change canon to horse, we could click OK, and then we can rerun it, and you'll see that I guess it's only in that one line. Now you can use buffered writers to write out to files and stuff like that. We will probably take a look at an example of that next week, but for this week and for this particular video, all I care about is you being able to understand how to read in a file. And I think I've covered the bases here. There's actually a lot of different ways that you can read through a line file. You can read in a file all at once and store it in a variable. You can read in a character at a time if you want to. But I feel like this is kind of a good middle of the road, and it's something that's probably useful in a lot of instances in the real world. where you wouldn't necessarily read in a character at a time, or you wouldn't necessarily read in the entire file at one click. So this is kind of a middle of the road. If you're interested in looking at other ways to do this, all you have to do is Google, Java how to read in a text file, and you'll find all kinds of examples out there that you can work from. So again, take a look at this. I'm going to post the assignment shortly, and you guys can take a crack at this yourself. Okay.